And then similarly to Dalton, I've been running a little bit more, which is quite the dramatic shift. But I think that's kind of the theme of this time period. I grew up in Stony Creek and Burlington, so I've kind of been, around the area, and just super excited to finally be in Dundas, which is, one of the best places. All right, Don.
Yeah, so my name's Don. I'm the third co-founder of the movement. As far as activities go, pretty much anything that gets me outside, and the deeper the better, I'd say. So rock climbing, backcountry camping, paddling, trail running, mountain biking. Those are sort of the movements that have always kind of kept me motivated to train, whether it be kind of like more traditional strength and conditioning or otherwise. I graduated PT school at McMaster back in 2011. And so my wife and I live here in the area, and just super excited to be finally practicing in the area, because I've been out of town for practice for a while. So looking forward to connecting with you all tonight, and hopefully this is real beneficial for you.
Awesome. So we'll jump into it. I'm just going to share my screen here. We got a little some slides for you guys. All right. So we will kick it off. So today's webinar, first off, Tyler, thanks for having us, and everyone else for joining us. We appreciate you taking the time out of your evening. Today's topic, the myths, the truths, and the how-tos of low back pain. I'm going to pass it over to Will. He's going to get us started with chapter 1.
All right. So just to kind of kick this off, we're going to get into some low back pain myths. I was going to ask this question to everybody, but the way things are set up, I don't know if I'd be able to see the answer. So maybe you can just kind of pop something in the chat. Like if you've ever had low back pain, just kind of pop it in the chat. Say whether you have or you haven't, just for our curiosity's sake. And, one of the things we've sort of thought about is, why there are so many myths with low back pain. I think it just comes to the fact that it's such a painful, disruptive thing to have. And we've been trying to figure out what back pain is for a super long time, for centuries. So, there's no wonder there's so many myths about it. Let's go on. And, the reason we want to go into some of the myths is just so we can kind of take some of these commonly held thoughts and beliefs and unravel them a little bit. That way we can start from a framework that makes a little bit more sense based off what we know. It's not that what we know is perfect, and it's probably going to change a little bit as things develop, and it always does. But we try to go from something that, is the most correct based off of what we know. So let's get into it. So the first thing here is that the idea that low back pain means that something is seriously wrong with your back. And this isn't to say that back pain isn't serious in terms of, what it means and how disrupting it can be for your life. And it can be super painful, and it can be a big threat to what you love to do. But from a medical perspective, the majority of back pain cases aren't medically serious, meaning they don't need kind of that next step beyond.
Can you turn that off?
What was that?
Are you watching?
Oh, if you guys wouldn't mind muting your screen, that would be helpful. But yeah, so most back pain isn't necessarily medically serious. So most of it gets better. I think it's about 90% gets better within 6 to 8 weeks. And most of the times we don't need to go any further medically. The next one is that low back pain means there's only one thing that's causing my pain. So there's actually a lot of things that can influence low back pain. So I'm going to throw a bit of a question up for you guys. And what you can do is just, if you want to answer, just unmute and tell us who you are and tell us your thoughts. So I'm going to ask, what do you think contributes? What do you think is a factor that contributes to back pain? Could be anything. No bad answers.
I'll jump in there. It's Jessica speaking. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. I find if I've had periods of inactivity,
Yeah.
like if I've had some lazy couple of weeks and I haven't been at the gym or doing anything, and then that tends to cause problems personally.
Mine's the same.
Is that Tyler?
Yeah.
Similar experiences?
If I take too lackadaisy with my training and I'm not very active, even just like not really going for walks or anything like that, I definitely notice my back.
Yeah, so being less active than you normally are, that's definitely something that contributes. I think Dalton can relate. He's had a couple lazy weeks.
Yeah.
But totally. And that's definitely something that can relate to back pain and contribute. Does anybody else have any other thoughts?
Some people have said sitting.
Sitting? So, sort of similar. It's sort of being in one position, not moving, not being as active as you normally would. Anybody else have any other thoughts you want to throw out there?
Yeah, I find that when I'm gardening, it's very easy to pull something, pulling some, like, not even like really tough weeds, but just all of a sudden you get that sharp pain from the movement.
So a certain movement that you have trouble with, that can be a factor, and we'll kind of dive into that a little bit more, I think, as we go. But certainly certain movements can be provocative for people, and it's usually different for everybody.
Okay.
All right. Anybody else? We'll go last one if somebody else has one.
Go ahead.
Okay. Can I talk? I'm Shelly.
Yeah.
Hi, Tyler.
Hi, Shelly.
Okay, so I've had ongoing lower back pain and very severe. So I'm not going to go into all the symptoms, but I really think that aging is a large part of it. And I can also say that after years and years of wearing high heels, I can tell you that it definitely has affected my back, and now I have to wear pretty much flats, and if I wear heels, and almost immediately I can feel my back pain. So yeah, also I have a herniated disc, so that's like all part of it. Again, I don't want to go into all those details, but there's some thoughts.
Yeah, so we're looking at some different things there, a few things like some tissue changes, age, footwear, kind of, we kind of categorize that in terms of like the position that you're in too, like similar, sort of the opposite of being sitting. It's sort of more of an extended position. So all of those things can certainly be factors. And I think that's kind of the main sort of thesis of that, is that there's lots of things that can contribute to back pain, and it can actually extend, even beyond some of those things to things like sleep, stress, worry, beliefs, nutrition, like all sorts of lifestyle factors, physical factors, that we'll get into later as well. So there's tons of different things that can contribute, and everybody's case is different. Myth number 3 is that low back pain means that you need imaging to get better. This is a big one, because over the years we sort of developed these technologies. We've been able to peer into our bodies deeper and deeper, and when we do that, we're going to see things. And so, what we found is, rather than this kind of being helpful for back pain, we've actually seen the trend continue, and it hasn't really impacted back pain in a positive way. And most of the times we don't need to seek imaging unless there's certain red flag symptoms and signs. which, you know, that's where having a good physio that you trust is great, because they can help rule those out for you and with you, and make sure that you don't need to go and seek, because of course there are certain circumstances where you do need to go and have imaging, but the majority of times it's not going to change kind of, you know, how we go about helping you.
Yeah, and I think further to that, Will, you know, I have a role in the public sector beyond our private clinic, and its primary purpose is to actually reduce the amount of imaging that is used for low back pain patients. My job is, you know, basically triaging people and providing self-management strategies for you know, for people who have been dealing with chronic and or subacute, so, you know, within the past 8 weeks of low back and leg related, or low back related leg pain. And, you know, the number of people who come in wanting imaging is astounding. Our wait lists would be, you know, even longer than they already are. And one of the reasons they implemented this program was exclusively to reduce the use of unnecessary imaging, because it can cause additional burden on people. It can actually make people feel worse when they, you know, when in fact the relevance of those findings are probably questionable, right? And so, but yeah, I just wanted to touch on that with my others.
Good points. The last thing is that a disc bulge means that you're doomed to have pain in the future. And this is one, you know, it sounds super scary. You know, that's a word that evokes that fear, I think. And in some people it doesn't. Once you know kind of the reality of disc bulges is that they're actually common, and they get more common as you get older. You can see some of the stats. It's 37% in 20-year-olds and as high as 96% in 80-year-olds. And these are people who report no pain. So sometimes we compare it to wrinkles inside our bodies. This doesn't mean, though, that the disc bulge is never relevant. It certainly can be a major factor in contributing to pain, but it isn't always. And it doesn't mean that you're doomed for pain in the future. In fact, the larger the bulge, the greater healing that occurs. All right. And then the last one here is I have a bad back, or the exercise I'm doing could be dangerous for my lower back. And this is something, you know, we can refer back to that kind of first question where we asked you guys if anyone has low back pain. And I think quite a few people answered that they've had it. And that's because it's super common. And it's actually, you know, you'd be kind of strange if you never had low back pain in your lifetime. World Health Organization estimates about 60 to 70%. It's possible that that's an under estimate. And then the other thing is that most activities are not strong predictors of low back pain on their own. And that just ties back to that other myth where we're talking about how back pain is super multifactorial. There's so many different factors that can influence it. So we have to look at the whole picture. Just because you have low back pain with a movement does not mean that that movement was bad for you. We might have to look into some of those other things. And that includes the dosage of that exercise, you know, whether you've been sedentary or less active in the previous little bit, things like that.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think, you know, we obviously don't want people to experience back pain, but trying to normalize the fact that you are going to experience it probably at some point in your life, I think is something we really try to do, because there can be a lot of fear around back pain. And there tends to be like, it's been a lot ingrained into our society that like, if you do experience back pain, that it could be something that you have to live with for the rest of your life. And that's not necessarily the case. And we want to try to instill a lot of positivity and hope into people when they do experience something like that. And we'll transition into the second chapter here, where we're going to talk a little bit about low back pain truths. So question for you guys, and I'm sure everyone's dealt with this, especially with the beautiful beautiful weather out lately is, have you ever had a really bad sunburn? So I know I have. I'm sure most of you guys can relate. If you guys want to put a yes or a thumbs up in the chat, that'd be great. But essentially, when you go into a shower, when you have a really bad sunburn, what tends to happen? It's generally not very pleasurable. So what is happening during this time? So we know that we already have the sunburn. Going into the shower isn't necessarily making the sunburn worse, but we experience more discomfort when we jump in that hot shower. So it's more of a sensitivity. So you're becoming more sensitive because of the water. And that's kind of how we like to view pain. So what does this mean when the sunburn becomes more painful, but the sunburn is actually not getting worse? It's just showing us that in the absence of an acute trauma, pain is more about sensitivity. So when you think of an acute trauma, yes, there's going to be damage that could be like a broken bone or like a sprained ankle where we know that we have damaged tissue. But things such as low back pain or other injuries, we can experience pain but not necessarily have trauma to the tissue. And that's why we like to think of pain more as a sensitivity. So what we like to do is, Will kind of mentioned earlier about how pain can be multifactorial and there's many things that influence it. We like to simplify things by splitting them kind of into two categories. And these two categories can both influence how sensitive your back discomfort can become. So we split it into physical load and psychological load. So I'm going to put a question out to you guys. What are some things that you think that could influence the sensitivity in your low back pain with regards to physical load? And so you guys can just unmute yourselves and answer if you have an answer, or if you don't want to talk, you could type it in the chat.
Maybe doing an exercise that you're not used to with high repetitions, or maybe a high amount of weight.
Yeah, totally. That's you kind of hit on two, a new movement that you're not used to doing. Also like a movement with high repetition. So such as like volume. So those are two things that we talk about that could influence like physical load. Anyone else have an answer?
Hi, Jessica here. What about like trying to do a new exercise and getting the movement wrong?
Yeah, so like technique.
Technique. That's a better word.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great answer, Jessica. That technique can definitely influence how physical loads are placed on your back. A good example would be like a deadlift. When you lift with the bar more close to your center of mass, it's generally a different load to the back as if you were lifting the bar from the bar being farther away. So that's a good point. Let's do one more in the physical load section. Does anyone have one more?
Inactivity.
Inactivity. Yeah, that would be like not enough load, which is good. You're right. And then especially inactivity followed by increased bouts of activity that your body may not be prepared for, kind of like how Tyler mentioned, like a new movement that you may not have done. So yeah, great point. Let's move over to the psychological load. What are some things that you think could influence the psychological load when it comes to sensitizing your low back discomfort?
Depression?
Sleep, stress, anxiety.
Yeah, we got a couple there. Sorry, I heard anxiety. I heard depression. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Tyler, what else did you say?
Just lack of sleep, stress, anxiety, things like that.
Yep. Yeah. So like hit on a couple there.
And raised a really good point. Prior experience, she said memory. And so that prior experience definitely influences our expectations around pain and expectations around movement for sure.
Yeah, that's a crazy thing because, like we have some really deeply ingrained memories even. Like if you think of a time where you're like walking and you come up to like a stick or something and your body's first instinct is like, oh, that's a snake. And then you sort of jump away from it. And then you realize that it's not a snake, it's a stick, so it just goes to show you like those can get so ingrained in your body. And it's not just snakes, it's things that we've had experiences with that really affect us. And that's sometimes hard to break apart.
Yeah, totally. And GT mentioned fear. That's a great one. We're going to scroll in here because you guys crushed this. You hit a lot of the points that we have down here. So physical load. So Tyler mentioned like sets and reps. So volume of training is something that we look at. Like how many reps and sets are you doing? How often are you doing it? The rate of loading is something that we like to think about. So tempo. So are you doing a long, like a slower movement where you're going to have more time under tension, or are you doing a more explosive movement where you're moving fast? The overall load on the bar or with a movement. Technique was a great one we talked about. Prior loading history is one. Like what type of exercise or programming have you done in the past? Is your body done these exercises, or is this a new type of thing for you? Moving into the psychological load, you guys hit on a bunch of them. Stress is one, whether it be work stress, financial stress, stress within the family, worries. So worrying about continuing with your sport or your activity that you love, worrying about your injury. Is it going to get better? Memory was mentioned in prior experiences, like Will was alluding to with the deeply ingrained fear of snakes. Negative beliefs. This is something that we talk about often. So, negative beliefs about your body. So if you have an injury or a back injury in the past, and thinking that you're now weak or your back is weak, or false beliefs around pain. So like we kind of talked a little bit about that, and we'll dive into a bit more of it in the next section. But these are all psychological lows that can influence your sensitivity. And so the important thing to note here is when your body cannot handle the cumulative load, which consists of both the physical load and the psychological load, you may become more sensitized in your low back, and it wants to protect you. So it does that by giving you a pain experience, or maybe giving you tightness or stiffness. It wants to make sure that you're protected and not doing something that's going to lead to further harm.
I think Dalton, it's really important to kind of note that our pain, like when our body, perceives pain, is well before our threshold for tissue injury. And I think that's a really important point to be aware of when you're dealing with an injury or when you're dealing with pain, because there's often a lot of fear of making a tissue injury worse. But very often pushing into a little bit of pain, and this is obviously case by case dependent, but can be okay, and in fact is often beneficial and helps to enhance that healing process by providing some stimulus.
Totally. And it's like you almost are part of this presentation, Don, because we're about to dive right into that right now. So great point. Good segue. So like Don was saying, it is a really good point. And we're going to drive it home right now. So if we look at this graph here, this is kind of what Don was talking about. When you look at the top here, we have tissue damage. This is our tissue damage line. Then we have what we just talked about, which is more of like our normal kind of tolerance line or our sensitivity line. When we have discomfort or back pain, that tolerance line drops down lower. So now we have a new line here. And essentially like what that results in is activities or movement or loads that may have not have influenced your discomfort or pain prior to the injury may now become sensitive. So things such as a particular movement. So maybe it is a deadlift if that's the movement that you potentially hurt your back on, but it can be as simple as just bending over to pick something up. That's an activity that normally wouldn't bother you, but because your tolerance line has now dropped because of an injury, you're way more sensitive to movement, and that can result in pain. The good thing about this is that if we look at the graph, we see that tissue damage is way up here. So we can be pretty confident that, even if you were doing some form of movement or exercise and you're getting a little bit of pain, we know you're well below that tissue damage line. So we know that you're not going to further harm yourself. We just have to make sure that we're not doing too much, that it's resulting in your pain levels going up so that you can't participate in the activity. So we like to take a gradual exposure approach, and we can kind of relate this back to our sunburn analogy. So if you think about the sunburn, if you get burnt really bad, you probably don't want to go out in the sun the next day. But it's probably also not a good idea to not go out in the sun for months, because if you don't go out in the sun for months, you'll probably feel a little bit better. Your your burn will go away. But then if you're to go right back out into the sun and spend a long time in the sun, you're probably going to get burnt again. So we like to take the gradual exposure approach where, you may take a little bit of time out of the sun, maybe a day or so, but then you're going to gradually expose yourself back to that sun. So maybe you're taking periods of an hour or two where you're in the sun and gradually increasing that over a couple of days to weeks to months until you get that perfect, beautiful tan that you're looking for. And so we can kind of relate this to how we would approach an injury with the back. We would start off with movements that you can tolerate, that you can move well with. If you get a little bit of pain, we know that that's okay because you're not doing more damage to yourself. And over time, we gradually expose you to more challenging positions or movements to help move that tolerance line back up to where it was before, so that you can then tolerate the movements, the activities that you want to be able to tolerate. Is there any questions that comes up with that before we move into the next part? Cool. So just a couple take-home points. Most low back pain is very similar to the sunburn and is more like sensitivity as opposed to actual tissue damage. There's many factors that can influence that, like we talked about, both physical and psychological loading. When our back hurts with movement, this is usually very far away from our actual damage line, so we can be confident that having you move a little bit into pain is okay. And then finally, we want to desensitize, calm it down, and rebuild up your back so that it can tolerate movements and loads that you want to withstand on a daily basis. So I'm going to pass it on to Will, and he's going to wrap up chapter 3 for you guys.
The how-tos, the good part.
Fun stuff.
Yeah, so the key here is, we never pretend to have the perfect fix, the one thing that can solve your pain. And if people do say that, I think there's good reason to be kind of wary of that. But what we do follow try to follow our principles and kind of steps that help guide the process in a reasonable way. So we kind of follow these 3 basic steps. Let's calm it down, build it up, and resume what you love. And the first one, we're kind of following the idea that movement is medicine. We know we want to keep moving. We know that movement can help desensitize things. It can help us feel better. And that can just be kind of thought of like, you get up in the morning and you're stiff and you get moving and you start feeling a little bit better. That's kind of a good example that I feel most people can relate to. Early on in the process, if things are really acutely sensitive, we'll often try to find the movements that are the least painful and start with that. That kind of just helps us build some momentum, no pun intended, and get going. So, this is just an example. Obviously, back pain can occur with bending backwards to the side, twisting, you name it. But a common one is bending forward. And when this is the most painful movement, oftentimes what we'll do is we'll try to incorporate some extension-based movements and positions to help calm things down. So that might lead to advice such as, limiting the time spent sitting where our back is rounded, and that might contribute to some of the sensitivity. So we limit that time spent sitting when we're walking a little bit more as able during the day. We might use a lumbar roll to put us in a little bit of extension. And then some we like using, we call them movement snacks. And so the idea here is, when things are really painful, it's kind of unrealistic to be like, hey, we're going to go and do 8 different exercises in a row. So we use movement snacks and we kind of just pop them in throughout the day. And you just get a steady diet just to keep things moving. And these are just some examples of extension-based exercises that, we might consider, but every case is going to be different. It depends on where you're at and how sensitive things are.
I think, Will, on that point, you said that movement is medicine. And, obviously we all agree on that point. But, if movement is medicine, then dosage matters, right? And that entry point matters, and everyone's dosage and everyone's entry point is different, right? And so we often hear people, oh, I've tried physio before, it didn't work, right? What's going to be different? And if we happen to be successful with that person who's tried and failed physio before, I'm not promising anything, but if we are, I find the most common issue, if it's not a misdiagnosis, the most common issue is wrong dosage, right? A poor entry point for, a deconditioned 70-year-old with spinal stenosis, aggressive extension protocol for someone with, an acute disc injury. Maybe you're doing the right movements, but the dosage is too much or too little, right?
Good point.
Yeah, great point.
Our second point is building it up. So this is, we're kind of going based off that. We mentioned it a little bit, but graded exposure. And habituation is a fancy word for kind of like things becoming stimulus, getting less sensitive over time. A common example I use is like the swimming pool analogy. So when you get in the swimming pool, it feels super cold, but then you get used to it. And what's happening here is not that the temperature is getting any warmer. It's just that your body's recognizing that that temperature is not a threat. It's not important. We're okay with it. And that's what habituation is. And that's kind of what we're trying to accomplish. If we go back to that sort of graph that Dalton showed us, then we're sort of trying to be somewhere around that sort of theoretical tolerance line that's become a little bit sensitive, so we can get your body used to it, recognizing it's not a threat, and then desensitizing. And in the previous example, this is where we would start doing a little bit more bending forward. So we're just kind of gradually doing exercises and movements that involve bending forward. And generally what we do is we follow this kind of stoplight approach. And this, we've kind of touched on this a little bit, that it is okay to have symptoms with low back pain while you're doing these exercises. But everybody is a bit different in how they respond to that. Some people respond pretty good with poking into quite a bit of pain, and it continues to get better and they feel empowered by that. Others do not. Others poke into a little bit of pain and it kind of sensitizes things further, and we got to back off. So we kind of use these as a way to gauge things, monitor it, and help us adjust. So generally speaking, what we do is we just say, if you're in the green zone, you're good to go. You can do as much of that as you normally would. Try a little bit of the yellow zone and see how it goes. Just trusting your body and knowing that hurt doesn't necessarily equal harm. And then what you'll do is you kind of see how you feel afterwards. And so if you check the next day and things are the same or they're better than they were when you did a movement, let's say bending over the day before, then good. That means, we responded pretty well and we can kind of continue to progress things along. If it got a little bit worse, we don't panic. We know that we're not necessarily damaging things further, but we do make an adjustment and we back off. So we kind of touched on this a little bit already, but the idea is we're just in this sort of stage of things, we're sort of starting to actually do a little bit more bending. And those are just some examples, with Don's rock climbing wall in the background. And then the last phase is resuming what you love, because this is the most important in my mind, because this is what keeps us motivated. The things that give you meaning in life. We referenced earlier that most back pain does get better within 6 to 8 weeks, but it's still a couple months of your life where you aren't necessarily able to live life normally, and it can be quite distressing. So having that goal in place and that goal in mind can keep you really motivated, and it just keeps us kind of in touch with the fact of, why are we trying to get rid of the pain in the first place? What is it that we need to get back to? So just to be clear, this is not always the easiest process. There can be trial and error, ups and downs, and slow progress. Requires a lot of trust, but it can be a really rewarding process when you realize how resilient you are, and how adaptable you are, and how you can, overcome something like back pain. And then each person's experience is going to be different. We talked about the multifactorial nature of things. Everybody popped out a lot of examples of those. And that means every person's rehab is going to look different as well. And these steps, they aren't always like A, B, and C. Sometimes it's a little bit messier than that, or like Don referenced a little bit earlier, like you're starting at a bit of a different sort of starting point.
Yeah, so that wraps it up. Thanks for joining us, guys. We appreciate it. We're going to address some questions, obviously, so don't run off too fast. There was some questions that were put in the Facebook group that we'll have Dawn kind of address. And then if you guys have any other questions that came up throughout the presentation, we'll give you all the time to ask those. You can unmute yourself and ask them, or put them in the chat. But let's have, Don, you want to address a couple of the questions that were put in the Facebook group, which we appreciate you guys for doing that.
Here we are. All right. Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm just pulling up the questions here. There's not going to be a particular order to the questions that I go through, because I do think we're going to have time to get through them all. But Jessica had asked about thou shalt nots of low back pain when exercising, and I think we sort of talked about the fact that there are no real. It's very case by case as far as a particular movement goes, right? In general, our body's meant to move, right? And our bodies tends to respond best to gradual progressive exposures, as opposed to acute changes or sharp spikes in the type of movement or the amount of movement you're doing. And so that's sort of the biggest thing to kind of bear in mind there. So yeah, I mean, even when people like talk about rounding their back with a deadlift or in a squat, to some extent it depends on what your exposure is. There are optimal movement patterns, and so when we're thinking about performance and things like this, so how well performance is, that matters. That technique matters. It's you're going to be more efficient at moving a weight or doing a movement. But flexing your back or extending your back is not inherently dangerous. So I'd say it's a very case-by-case basis, and gradual exposure is important. Does that answer your question on that regard, Jessica?
Yes, yeah, it does. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, no worries. And so I think it's George or Jorge, maybe. He asked about rest or push yourself exercising for low back pain. And my perspective on that is that rarely is rest best. Okay. When we talk about rest, we talk about relative rest. And so I think that was sort of referenced a bit throughout the presentation about, it's more about modifying symptomatic activities and triggering movements, and sometimes eliminating them altogether for a period of time, with a gradual reintroduction when things have desensitized. And so, but almost across the board, I can say that complete rest is going to generally be worse for you. You're going to have, muscular deconditioning. You're going to develop, stiffness in your muscles and joints. You're going to lose confidence in your body's ability to move. And so, again, finding that entry point is just so important to maintaining people's sort of sense of confidence and, ability to kind of keep on, right? Does that answer your question there, George? Or
George isn't on today.
Oh, okay.
That's a good question, though. It's Don. I'm just going to tag on to the end of that because we can talk about the other end of the spectrum as well. He mentioned pushing, when to push through pain, and we talked a little bit about using the stoplight analogy to guide us. So that's going to be individual to everyone we see. We can't say like you should push or not push, but that's going to come again with trial and error. Like we're always going to continue to progress people and challenge them and push into a little bit of discomfort. And then we base it off how does that individual respond. And sometimes the individual will respond very well and we can continue to progress. And sometimes it doesn't, and you get a little bit aggravated or irritated, and we just kind of go back to the drawing board. And we like to think of it as just kind of giving us more information into what you tolerate, and we just adjust your program as is. The one thing we do want to avoid is pushing too much to the point where you're so aggravated that we can't do anything. And that is also something that I think people run into sometimes as they do way too much. They're so sore that they can't even participate in any of the activities or exercises that we're trying to work on them with. So there's kind of both ends of the spectrum there.
With that being said, the research is pretty solid, and in terms of like people that tend to try to stay active have better outcomes, and so they're always leaning towards that.
Yeah, and I think that talks speaks to the multifactorial nature of low back pain. Staying active, staying moving, doing things that you enjoy is going to keep you in a better psychological space and ward off those other psychological issues that can increase your pain experience, right? So Margaret asked about, is walking it out really best for low back pain? I think we sort of just talked through that. I mean, there may well be some periods where if you're very, what we call, extension intolerant, that movement of leaning back, then we may, reduce the amount of walking that you're doing since it's an extension dominant movement. But generally, yes, activity is best. As far as the best stretches for low back pain, it's really hard to say on a generic basis. But in that presentation, Will went over a few movements that are generally helpful for people who have back pain with bending, and some movements that are generally good for people who have pain with backwards leaning, right? And then the third part to that same question was in regards to like healing time for a tailbone fracture. And how to speed this up. So something that's really important to bear in mind with, and I don't know what kind of fracture this is, whether it was a stress fracture or a compression fracture, and there's a lot of nuances, I would suppose, to the answer to this. But as far as any type of healing, and in particular bone healing, nutrition is ever so important, right? So that's something that's worth talking to a dietitian or a naturopath or someone about. So really doing a good sort of dietary analysis to see how are you again, where do you stand from a nutrient perspective, and is there something that we can do to enhance this? The second thing is that bones respond to stress, right? As all tissues do. If you don't load it, it's not going to heal, right? Once you've got a certain amount of healing, in the case of a bone, of course. But gradual progressive loading is what is going to build up a stronger bone. That tailbone fracture will heal, though, Margaret. There's a great book by Stu McGill on it's called The Gift of Injury, and it goes through the story of a world-class powerlifter who literally sheared his sacrum in half and was on the cusp of suicide, and then and sorry, it's a really terrible, that's sort of a bit of a morbid tale there, but he then came back to win world records of deadlifting, and the imaging of his tailbone pre and post appropriate rehabilitative programming is remarkable. You would think that the images were flipped because the bone after a year of this particular rehab program and progressive loading, it looked like a healthy teenager's tailbone. It's pretty remarkable. But moral of the story is there's a lot of variables there. Nutrition is super important, and an appropriately graded loading program, whether that's walking and or strengthening, to account for the different types of loads that the tailbone takes, and making sure that there's an appropriate rest period between doses. Right? Does that help, Margaret? I know it kind of.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's definitely really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I never thought of the nutrition factor.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm glad that if that alone is beneficial, then an avenue that you take, that's great. Awesome.
I think
Are there any other questions at all?
Yeah, let's open it up. If you guys have any questions, go ahead and shoot.
Yeah. What we got?
Howard.
Would you say that if you have a minor injury, that TENS machine treatment is helpful for lower back or other parts of the back as well?
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of a TENS machine first. The purpose of a TENS machine is really to it pretty much tricks your body into not feeling pain by sort of hyper stimulating the nerves in that area, and so it desensitizes the area. And so if you use TENS by itself, and then you're just like, great, my back feels a little bit better, you're not actually addressing whatever the underlying issue is, whether it's a capacity issue. Maybe the muscles in your back don't have enough endurance or strength for what your daily loads are, or maybe your back's asking for more movement and you don't give it to it. I think of something like a TENS machine as creating a window of opportunity to do the things that are going to make your back feel better for the longer term. Does that help?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome, Howard.
Any
Hey.
other?
I've got a quick question.
Go ahead.
Sometimes I'll use like a foam roller or even like a tennis ball on my SI joint, and it kind of, I feel like it makes it feel better. Is that okay to do that, or?
Yeah. We often talk about again, a lot of these different, we call them modalities, whether it's a TENS machine or acupuncture, joint manipulation, soft tissue massage, foam rolling, all of these things we think of as modalities, and we think of them as pain modalities. And so, to Howard's question, it kind of creates an opportunity to, and you might find this, it feels good for a short period of time, and then it sneaks back up, and it feels good for a short period of time.
I wouldn't think of it as a treatment, but like, I'm not going to hurt myself doing that or make it worse.
No, I think our body's pretty smart and pretty good at telling us if we're doing something that's harmful. And you're telling me that it makes you feel better. So I would say, if it feels good, do it.
Unless you like, jump on it or something like that,
Yeah. Sometimes my rehab approach is a little hedonistic in that regard, right? If it feels good, do it. But you do need to also recognize that, like, if you have something that keeps sneaking up, it's maybe worth kind of trying to delve into why that's sneaking back up on you.
Dalton's already helping me, so.
Right on.
She got a bonus tip from Don.
You were testing us. Dalton already told you that, and you wanted to make sure we were all on the same.
It's good question though, because a lot of those a lot of modalities actually work fairly similarly, and do work temporarily, but it's still fine to use it. Like, I definitely, you know, especially if it's a way to get you moving, like, I've definitely had situations where using a lacrosse ball is the thing that I needed at that time, and it helps. So there's nothing wrong with it. We'll just never tell you that you have to use it, that it's something that is necessary, right, for you to get better.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think if like a passive modality like that, or even like something like foam rolling that's a little bit more active, if that's the only, if that's the mainstay of a treatment plan,
It's not. That's not what Dalton said to do.
I trust Dalton 100%.
Dalton's like, wait, no.
I'm speaking more at large, you know. If that's the mainstay of a treatment plan, I think it's worth sort of asking questions about whether there's anything else that can be done to move the needle forward.
Okay.
Such good questions.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, super engaging. We love questions. I think this is the value of sticking around for the whole presentation, is getting your deepest rehab questions responded to as best we can.
Yeah.
Is like strength training in general, is it protective? Like, are you better?
Number one, it is like, the strength training is probably the most well-supported injury risk reduction tool that we have. Above mobility work, above, regular joint adjustments or anything like that. Strength training consistently, go Tyler. Strength training consistently has the best results.
Great.
And then even if you look at the research, very often, rarely do you see like other things independent of strength training. And so it's sort of like sometimes, the waters are muddied in research, right?
Yeah.
Especially this type of research.
So how do you guys recommend that people work together with their care team? So if you're working with a personal trainer and you're working with a physiotherapist and maybe you're working with a chiropractor or a dietitian, as you guys mentioned, how do you think that those care teams can best work together, and how can you, as the kind of patient at the center, best communicate like amongst everyone to make sure that you're setting yourself up for the best outcomes?
I think communication is key. I think you said it right there, communication. But how do you communicate? In reality, a lot of clinicians can be quite busy. But I find the easiest way, if there's not sort of a direct line, and if there's like 4 or 5 moving parts, having everyone take some time to write a bit of a clinical note, like a progress note, is a good way to sort of get everyone onto the same page, right? But
I can speak as a client. Right away when I first started seeing Dalton, he spoke to my coach to find out like what my program was like, and he kind of keeps up to date with like what I'm doing. I run and I do strength training, so he knows what days I run, and I provide feedback like on both the exercises, the physio exercises, but also how the run felt or any issues and whatnot. So it's been good that way, that he's aware of like what I'm doing.
Yeah, and that's something that we really, thanks for that, Julia. Yeah, that's something that we really try to focus on, because like that open line of communication between everyone, whether it's like a strength coach or a dietitian, is so important. And we really try to stay in our own lane. Like if we're to be working with a strength and conditioning coach, or let's say Tyler, for example, like we know that Tyler's capable of putting together a strength program that's going to be appropriate for you as the individual. Our job is to understand that, so we have the knowledge to understand what's going on, which is important, but also to layer in what we know. And that's what we just talked about, is some factors that influence pain. How can we help build that into the programs that the strength coach is putting in for the individual, and have them be aware of some things that they just may not be considering or just may not have that knowledge in, and we always try to help educate them just as well as they help educate us on things. So that's kind of how we always, I'll speak for myself, how I always go about approaching it. And I know Will and Don are very, very similar in that way as well.
Yeah, certainly. I'm old school. I still make phone calls instead of text. So I would way rather talk to the other clinicians involved, but also whether or strength coach, chiro, whatever. But it's a matter of the phone tag thing. So sometimes if you're having trouble on the face-to-face connection or the phone connection, then that progress note sort of approach can help get people on the same page as well.
And to swing back to the question, were you referring to like how we communicate, or were you also referring to like how you as the patient could be communicating to the group of clinicians? Because that's a little bit different too. And sorry, I missed who asked the question.
I think that sort of what's our role in terms of making sure that we're putting people together, or like how do we best kind of, because obviously we want to advocate for our care, but we also want to make sure that we're keeping the lines of communication open, or we're not, I don't know.
Yeah, no.
Making it worse by having too many people.
Yeah, it's a good point. That's a really good point. I think it's something that people struggle with because there's so many different avenues that you can take, right? And I think the most important thing, and you hit it, is like to always advocate for yourself. Like make sure that you're being heard. And if you aren't being heard by your healthcare practitioners, then you need to maybe reconsider like who you're seeing, because you should always be at top of mind. But something we try to do is like, it's good to see multiple people, but at the same time, some too much influence is also challenging, because what we run into is like, oh, you see the physio and the chiro, and you see like maybe a massage therapist, and it's like, okay, well, what's working, like what's helping and what's not helping. And sometimes when there's a lot of like cooks in the kitchen, it can influence that. So I'll always try to approach it like, I'm never going to say don't go to see X healthcare professional if you find it beneficial, but I will say like, hey, like this is what I think is important for you, and this is the plan, and here's why. And I think maybe, making sure we focus on just that plan so we know what's not working and we can adjust it is important. And then I leave that up to us as a team to decide what's best. And sometimes people are like, yeah, that's a great idea. Other people are like, you know what, I really like this and I'm going to continue to see this person. And that's totally fine. But that's kind of how I would say I would interact with someone, and how you could go about doing that with your healthcare practitioners.
And from your perspective as well, like asking questions and knowing what you want to get out of it is really important. Like we love questions, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because it gives us an opportunity to kind of explore things, and you learn more by doing that. And I think that's super important from your perspective, is just to ask those questions. Like that's what you're there for.
Guys, this was hugely informative for us. Thank you so much. We learned a lot and appreciate you taking the time. We must run.
All
right, Howard. Yeah,
thank you
so
much.
The opportunity.
Oh, hey,
Big pardon, Kelly.
Yeah.
I really, really appreciate it. Yeah.
Our pleasure. Nice to see you. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Okay, stay safe, everyone.
On that note, guys, we will wrap up. We went about 6 minutes over time here. But we did promise a giveaway for those who put the questions in the Facebook. So we did a random draw, and Margaret, you are the winner of Movement Swag. So we will make sure that we get that to Tyler, and he can get it off to you as soon as we can. But we appreciate the questions in the Facebook group, and we appreciate you guys tuning in. It was fun. You guys were very engaged, and that always makes it really, really fun for us. So thank you for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Dalton, Will, and Don.
Thanks so much.
Awesome.
Margaret, send Tyler your T size.
Yeah.
They are women's. They are women fit, like a women's fit tee. Even the one Dalton's wearing.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everybody. Hopefully we'll see people around.
Yeah, soon.
Thanks so much. Looking forward to seeing you guys soon.
Yeah, definitely.
GT, if you ever want to connect over clinical stuff, reach out, man.
All right, take
Okay.
care.
Yeah.